When Quang's family arrives unannounced and quietly discovers that Linda is pregnant, love is no longer just about two people. Tradition, reputation, and family expectations step into the room, and Quang must decide whether he stands with the woman he loves or the family that raised him. The doorbell rang twice, quick and certain. Linda looked up from the cutting board. She'd been slicing strawberries into a bowl, moving slower than she used to. In the living room, Quang sat with his laptop open and a call running low in his ear. He muted himself the moment he heard the bell. "Are you expecting anyone?" Linda asked, wiping her fingers. Quang glanced at the time as if it might explain the moment. "No." The bell rang again. He ended the call, set his phone down, and went to the door. Linda followed at an easy pace, her hand drifting to her belly out of habit. Quang opened the door. A woman in a cream coat stood in the hallway, hair swept back neatly, smile polite but controlled. Beside her was another woman, slimmer, holding her handbag with both hands. A driver waited a few steps behind them. "Quang," the woman said, "you didn't answer my call." "Mom," Quang replied. Linda felt the air shift. The woman's gaze moved past Quang and landed on Linda. "You must be Linda." Linda nodded. "Hello, please come in." "This is my aunt," Quang said, stepping aside. "Aunt Lan." Aunt Lan gave a brief nod, eyes already scanning the apartment as if she were checking a list. Quang's mother entered first, looking around without pretending she wasn't. Her gaze paused on a framed photo of Quang and Linda outdoors, both laughing into the wind. "I was nearby," she said. "I thought it was time I saw where you've been living." Linda moved toward the kitchen. Offering tea was something she could do with her hands when her thoughts didn't know where to go. "Would you like jasmine tea?" "Tea is fine," Quang's mother said, sitting on the sofa. Aunt Lan chose the chair opposite and placed her bag on her lap like a barrier. Quang stayed standing a moment, hands in his pockets, then sat with a calm that looked effortless if you didn't know him. Linda set the kettle on the stove. The blue flame clicked on. She set cups on a tray and listened to their voices behind her. "You've been busy," his mother said. "Work is work," Quang answered. "And your personal life?" Aunt Lan asked. "People talk." Quang didn't rise to it. "Linda and I live together." Silence. Not shock, more like a quiet recalculation. Linda carried the tray into the living room and set it down carefully. Quang's mother watched her hands, the slight tremble Linda tried to hide. "You're young," she said. "I'm 26, Linda replied. It didn't land as approval. Quang's mother lifted her cup but didn't drink. "What do you do?" "I used to work in marketing. Now I freelance from home." Aunt Lan's eyes flicked to Quang. "Because he asked you to?" Linda kept her voice even. "Because it fits our life right now." Quang's mother studied Linda's face. "You look tired." Linda's hand moved to her belly before she could stop it. Just a light touch, the way she checked in with herself when she was being watched. The room went still. Aunt Lan leaned forward. "What is that?" Linda dropped her hand to her lap too late. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. Quang's hand settled on her knee, not squeezing, just present. "She's pregnant," he said. No apology, no pleading, just the truth. Quang's mother set her cup down with care. Aunt Lan's eyes widened, then narrowed. "How far?" Quang's mother asked. 4 months, Quang said. Aunt Lan let out a small breath. "So this happened before any official wedding?" "Yes," Quang said. Quang's mother looked at Linda. "Was it planned?" Linda held her posture steady. "No, but we're happy." The word felt smaller than she wanted it to. Quang's mother's expression tightened, disappointment held in place. Happy is not the same as proper. she said quietly. Quang's thumb made one small circle against Linda's knee, a reminder to breathe. "We're getting married," Quang said. His mother's eyes went to him. "When?" Quang hesitated, just long enough for the question to bite. Linda felt the weight of his world in that pause. Schedules, scrutiny, the way timing never belonged to them alone. Aunt Lan used it. "Do you understand what this looks like?" she asked Linda. "His name isn't private." Linda met her gaze. "I understand," she said, "but I didn't force him. I love him. He loves me. We'll take responsibility." Quang's mother turned to her son. "Is that true?" "Yes," Quang said, steady. His mother leaned back as if the room had grown heavier. "You should have come to us," she said, "before it reached this point." "We wanted peace," Quang replied. "We wanted to build a real life first." Aunt Lan's mouth tightened. "Peace," she echoed, like it was a luxury. Quang's mother stood. She didn't raise her voice, and that restraint made everything sharper. She smoothed her skirt and looked at Linda. "I won't make a scene in your home," she said. "You're carrying a child. I'm not heartless." Linda heard the distance in it anyway. "But you," his mother said to Quang, "will speak with me privately, today." Quang rose. "All right." Aunt Lan stood as well, gathering her bag. Her eyes stayed on Linda. "You should rest," she said, and it sounded like instruction. Quang's mother paused at the doorway and looked back once. "I hope you understand," she said. "A family doesn't only accept, a family decides." Then she left. The door closed softly. In the kitchen, the kettle began to whistle, a sharp sound trying to make the apartment ordinary again. Linda stayed seated, hands clasped together. Quang stood still for a beat, then crossed to her and crouched in front of the sofa. "Hey," he said low. Linda blinked fast. She didn't let the tears fall. She didn't want drama. She just wanted the ache in her chest to stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and hated that it came out first. Quang's brow creased. "Don't say that. It's your family," she said. "I don't want to be the reason you—" "You're not a reason," he cut in gently. He took her hands, warming her fingers between his palms. "You're my choice, you and this baby." Linda looked down at their hands, at how steady he was. Quang stood and walked into the kitchen, turning off the stove. When he returned, he sat beside her and pulled her into his side carefully, as if every movement mattered. Outside, a car door closed. An engine started. The sound drifted away down the street. Linda let her hand return to her belly, not hiding it this time. Quang's fingers followed, covering hers, steady and warm. She leaned into him and let her breathing slow until the room felt like home again. Quang waited until the street below went quiet before he spoke again. "They didn't come to hurt you," he said, more to himself than to Linda. Linda stayed close to him on the sofa, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. She could hear his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt. It was steady, but she knew him well enough to feel the tension under it. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it harder." Quang shifted, turning slightly so he could look at her face. "Harder how?" "They weren't cruel," Linda said slowly. "They were disappointed. Like they already decided where I fit. Or don't." Quang didn't interrupt. He had learned that silence was sometimes the most useful thing he could offer. Linda continued, her voice calm but thin. "If they'd yelled or blamed me, I could have pushed back. But this, it makes me feel like I'm something that needs to be corrected." Quang's jaw tightened. He reached for her hand again, threading their fingers together. "You don't." "I know you don't think that," she said, "but they do. And they're your family." The word family hung between them, heavier now than it had been an hour ago. Quang leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I grew up learning how to manage rooms like that," he said. "How to stand still while people decide things for you. I thought I'd left that behind." Linda shifted so she could see his face. "You didn't fail," she said. "You stood up for me." "I should have done it sooner," he replied. "I should have told them before they showed up unannounced." Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would it really have changed anything?" Quang exhaled. "Probably not." They sat like that for a while, listening to the small sounds of the apartment settling. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Somewhere upstairs, someone walked across the floor. Linda felt a wave of tiredness move through her, sudden and deep. She shifted her weight, trying to find a comfortable position. Quang noticed immediately. "You should lie down," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said gently. "And that's okay." He stood and offered his hand. Linda took it, letting him help her up. They moved toward the bedroom, slower than usual, as if both of them were careful not to disturb something fragile between them. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, while Quang pulled a blanket over her legs. He knelt to take off her shoes, the way he always did when she was tired. She watched him, the simple intimacy of the gesture tightening her throat. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I want to," he replied, not looking up. When he finished, he sat beside her. Linda leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. His arm came around her automatically. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, "that maybe I should have tried harder to be more acceptable." Quang stiffened slightly. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Different clothes, different words, less me." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "Linda." She met his eyes, already knowing what he was about to say. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't start shrinking yourself to fit someone else's comfort." She gave a small, tired smile. "I'm not trying to." "But you're thinking about it." She didn't deny it. Quang took her face gently between his hands. "I didn't choose you because you were easy to explain," he said. "I chose you because when I'm with you, I don't have to perform." Linda swallowed. "And what if loving me makes your life harder?" He leaned his forehead against hers. "It already has, and it's still worth it." Her eyes filled. This time she didn't stop the tears. They slid down slowly, warm against her cheeks. Quang brushed them away with his thumb, patient and unhurried. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. I'm scared that one day you'll wake up and realize you're tired of choosing me." Quang shook his head. "I choose you every day," he said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." She breathed him in, the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with home. Her body relaxed against his without asking permission. After a moment, he stood. "Stay here," he said. "I'll make you something warm." She nodded, already sinking into the pillows. In the kitchen, Quang moved quietly. He poured water into a pot, set it on the stove, added ginger and honey the way she liked. His phone buzzed on the counter. He didn't look at it. When he brought the mug back, Linda was half asleep. He sat beside her and helped her sip slowly. "Better?" he asked. "A little." He set the mug down and lay back beside her, careful of her space. She turned onto her side, facing him, her hand finding his chest again. "Your mother said a family decides," Linda murmured. "Yes." "Do you think she'll ever decide for me?" Quang thought about it honestly. "I don't know." She nodded, accepting the uncertainty. "But," he continued, "I've already decided." Her fingers curled slightly in his shirt. They lay there as the afternoon light shifted across the room. Linda's breathing evened out, her eyes finally closing. Quang stayed awake, watching her, one hand resting over hers on her belly. There was fear in him, yes. There was pressure waiting outside these walls. But there was also a quiet certainty he hadn't felt in years. This, right here, was real. And for now, that was enough.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.